Moving on to the fourth and last chapter, OHS Risk and Decision Making has been also a particular challenge. And so I'm going to ask Carmel Bofinger, who is also from MISC, from the University of Queensland. She is the main author on this, and in doing so I should also acknowledge the contribution of MISC, not only in the, for example, with the design chapter where there was Robin and Tim's time, but MISC have underwritten Carmel's time in writing this chapter. They have also provided resources for running 2 workshops on this chapter. So it is important that I acknowledge MISC's contribution there. There's also 2 other contributing authors to this chapter, and Carmel will refer to Jan and Chris's contributions as well. When Carmel has given her overview, John Green from Laing Rourke is going to give his OHS Professional's perspective. So Carmel, thank you. The bottom one goes forward.
Well, I would certainly agree with Pam that it was a challenge. It does bring 2 of the, I guess, most challenging concepts for OHS professionals together. And both of them individually would fill a library. To try and bring them together in a chapter in a way which was meaningful for an occupational health and safety professional really was a challenge. And I would certainly like to thank Jan, who's here today, and Chris Bierman for their contribution. They covered 2 particularly difficult areas, I believe, and condensed the information in a way in which it was readable and usable and I think understandable to OHS professionals. So I'm going to do a fairly practical, I guess, summary of why, how, who and what for the chapter, just to give you a summary of what happened. So there is already a chapter on risk in the book, and that one looks at, written by Professor Jean Cross, and that looked at the nature of risk, the need to control risk, and the need for an organisation to effectively understand the extent of a risk if they're going to manage the risk. So this chapter builds on the information that was included in that chapter, and it specifically looks at some of the drivers and barriers for integration of OHS risk into decision making, and the ways in which OHS professionals can understand the factors influencing decision making and the way in which decisions are made, and use then that knowledge of how decisions are made to influence decision makers and to provide advice to decision makers to ensure that the information coming out of OHS risk is included in decisions. We had a very active technical panel, which I did appreciate. They were very forthright in identifying the issues that needed to be considered and in their comments regarding the chapter as it developed as well. We had excellent input into the chapter. About 12 months ago, we had the initial workshop that was held at the University of Queensland. We had about 38 industry, government, academic, OHS professionals at that workshop. And through that workshop, we developed the outline for the chapter about what we considered needed to be included. We had various experts included in that chapter who were practitioners and decision makers in industry who also contributed to that chapter. I've mentioned our technical panel who were very active and included Professor Jean Cross, who wrote the original risk chapter. And about 2 weeks ago, we had a final review workshop. So that was a smaller number, about 9 of the original group from the original workshop that had been held 12 months ago, to review the content of the chapter and to provide some final advice on what needed to be included in the chapter. So I was there as one of the authors, one of the main authors, and I guess I was responsible for pulling it together. We did have Dr. Jan Hayes, who's here with us, and Jan provided an understanding of decision making and the evolution of different decision making theories and the way in which decisions are made, and the sense making process that Andrew talked about earlier is included in that process. So very much based on a lot of the work that Jan has done in a very practical sense. So it made that whole concept of decision-making theory, I think, accessible to practitioners. The other contributing author was Chris Bierman, who works for the Appleton Institute at the University of Central Queensland. And he talked about the factors factors influencing decisions about risk. So both the internal and the external factors that influence decision makers generally, and more specifically about how they might include risk. So we pulled all this together, and then what's included then in the chapter is this theoretical understanding of decision making. So what are the different ways in which people understand decisions being made? Given the fact that a lot of OHS professionals come from either a science or an engineering background, I think we tend to think that decisions should be made by identifying the problems, identifying alternative solutions, weighing up the value of those alternative solutions and selecting the best one. What the chapter aims to do is to very clearly identify to OHS professionals that that's not how decisions are actually made, that there are a whole heap of other factors that need to be included if you're going to understand what decision making is all about and be able to influence how decisions are made and provide advice to decision makers. So we tried to do a marriage, I guess, of that theoretical framework for decision making and some practical ways in which the OHS professional can use their skills and their understanding of decision making to influence decisions, particularly those associated with OHS risk. So it's provides both a theoretical and a practical framework. It does provide some guidance on communicating risk and the importance of making sure that we've considered the uncertainties associated with risk, the difficulty that some people can have understanding that uncertainty associated with risk, particularly when it relates to trying to make a decision, how we can influence decisions generally, and the way in which as professionals we can provide advice and what people are looking for on providing advice. So while it was challenging, it was rewarding. And I would like to thank Jan and Chris particularly for the contributions that they made, and also the industry people who were very much involved in putting the chapter together.
I think from a practitioner's perspective, the value of the chapter is that it debunks an awful lot of isms that exist out there about risk, and moves risk from its traditional place in a compliance network, in a compliance framework which is very dry, and moves it into a social construct. So risk is much more about a social construct. I think it also, in marrying the notion of risk with decision making, it allows us to shed some light on the fundamental difficulty that workers face every day, and that is the difference between work as planned and work as done, and allows us then as practitioners to cast a very different gaze upon the problems that workers face every single day and the tasks that we expect them to complete. There's a couple of questions I think naturally come from that then, and I'll fire them at you. What's the value in this then for practitioners? Practitioners in qualifying will probably already consider themselves to be naturally good decision makers and pretty adept at managing risk because they've got their degree to show that they are. What's the value then that the chapter brings to them?
I think probably the most value from that point of view is the understanding that decisions, the complex way in which decisions can be made and the diverse number of influences that will impact on a decision. So if we're only considering the value of the OHS aspect of it, it's relatively simple to make a decision. When we have multiple factors that need to be considered in that decision, including efficiency and cost and productivity and political issues, etc., then it makes it a much more difficult decision to make. And understanding, I think, from an OHS professional point of view, that we're not considering a decision maker doesn't consider a single aspect. That a decision maker makes decisions based on their whole range of experience and a range of external factors that influence them as well, I think will assist the practitioner in understanding how to best influence those decisions.
So there's already a chapter on risk management.
Yep.
Yeah. What's the purpose then of a chapter on risk and decision making? Where's the difference?
I think the decision making, the risk process is the nature of risk, the understanding of risk, the need that we need to put controls in place to manage it, that we need to understand the extent of the risk and how it's going to impact on the health and safety of the workers that are there. When we come to actually including that information into decisions, I think that's the difference. We need to understand risk as best we can. We need to understand the uncertainties associated with the risk. And I think it's often that uncertainty that's associated with risk that makes it difficult for the decision makers to include that information into the decision that's there. So this extends, I guess, on the information that's already included.
Okay, one more, if I may. Decision-making seems to imply then, having decision-making in the chapter, seems to imply that safety is not all black and white. Yeah? Occupational health and safety is not all black and white. With a chapter on risk and decision-making and a chapter on organisational culture or organisational arrangements, does this mark a shift in the body of knowledge away from a compliance-based piece of work towards something that's perhaps slightly more humanistic in nature?
Yes. I think from that point of view, whether that's the philosophy that's meant to sit behind it, yes, I think it does. I think it was interesting. One of the comments that was made on the chapter from one of the review panels was, why are we actually worried about decision making? We have an obligation to manage OHS risk, a legal obligation to manage OHS risk. There isn't an option about whether we make a decision about managing it or not. And I think that's from the legal framework, that's absolutely right. From the practical framework, I think it's a little bit different. And so I think it is a move away. I think it's an increase in understanding, if you like, of the real world that's there. And I don't know, Pam, whether you want to make a comment on that aspect of it.
And I think that gives me a wonderful lead-in, but before I take that lead, I'd like to thank all of the authors of the 4 chapters that we have launched today. I would like to thank the authors who have taken up the challenge of actually trying to give a flavour of that chapter in just a few minutes, and also the OHS professionals who were asked to read the chapter in their busy life and make some comments about it.